Welcome to Boring History and Stories. I'm glad you're here. This channel is dedicated to long, quiet history stories, the kind you can listen to slowly, without pressure, whether you're relaxing, resting, or preparing to fall asleep. There's no need to concentrate on every detail. You can simply let the story unfold at its own pace. If you find these kinds of calm, in-depth stories helpful or enjoyable, you're welcome to subscribe so you can return whenever a new one is uploaded. And if you'd like, you can leave a comment as well. I always enjoy seeing where people are listening from, whether it's late at night, early in the morning, or somewhere in between. For now, take a moment to get comfortable. There's nothing you need to do, and nowhere you need to be. In this video, we'll be exploring a moment that quietly changed the course of history, the fall of Constantinople in the year 1453. It's a story about time, endurance, and the slow turning of eras. Let's begin. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople stood between worlds. It rose from the waters where Europe meets Asia, where ships passed between seas and empires crossed paths. Founded in the 4th century by Constantine the Great, the city was designed not merely as a capital, but as an idea, a continuation of Rome itself. Over time, it became the heart of the Byzantine Empire, a place where ancient Roman authority blended with Christian faith, Greek culture, and imperial ceremony. To those who lived within its walls, Constantinople felt protected by history. The city had survived for centuries against overwhelming odds. It had endured invasions, civil wars, religious conflict, and plague. Its massive stone fortifications, known as the Theodosian Walls, were considered among the greatest defensive structures ever built. They had repelled attackers time and again, creating the belief that Constantinople was not meant to fall. Yet by the 15th century, the city's greatness existed mostly in memory. The Byzantine Empire had shrunk to a fraction of its former size. Its territories were scattered and isolated, surrounded by rival powers. Constantinople itself was sparsely populated, where bustling districts once stood. Empty land and abandoned buildings now stretched between pockets of life. Farms appeared within the city walls. Ancient forums lay silent. Still, the city mattered. Constantinople controlled the Bosphorus Strait, the vital passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Whoever held the city could regulate trade, naval movement, and communication between continents. It was not only a prize of wealth, but of influence, and for centuries it had remained just out of reach. Beyond the city walls, a new power was rising. The Ottoman Empire had expanded steadily across Anatolia and southeastern Europe. Its rulers combined military innovation with strict organization. Their armies were disciplined, their leadership ambitious, and their state increasingly centralized. By the early 1400s, the Ottomans had surrounded Constantinople on nearly every side. In 1451, a young man ascended the Ottoman throne. His name was Mehmed II. At just 19 years old, Mehmed was already deeply aware of his place in history. He was highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, and fascinated by conquest and legacy. From an early age, he had studied maps of Constantinople, its walls, its harbors, and its weaknesses. To him, the city was not merely a strategic objective, it was destiny. Mehmed believed that conquering Constantinople would transform the Ottoman state into an empire worthy of the ancient world. It would give him legitimacy, prestige, and control over the region's most important crossroads. He prepared carefully, methodically, and with patience. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI ruled over a city filled with quiet tension. He was a capable and determined leader, but his resources were limited. His army was small, his treasury nearly empty, and his hopes rested largely on foreign assistance that might never arrive. Despite this, Constantine refused to abandon the city. Church bells rang daily. Religious processions moved through the streets. Citizens prayed openly for deliverance. At the same time, life continued in small, fragile routines. Markets opened. Fishermen worked the shores. Soldiers manned the walls, watching the horizon. By the winter of 1452, preparations intensified. Mehmed ordered the construction of a massive fortress along the Bosphorus, cutting Constantinople off from naval support. He gathered troops from across his territories and invested heavily in artillery. Among his weapons were enormous cannons capable of firing stone projectiles unlike anything the city had faced before. These cannons represented a shift in warfare itself. Walls that once symbolized permanence now faced a force designed to undo centuries of security. As spring approached, both sides understood what was coming. On April 6, 1453, the Ottoman army arrived outside Constantinople. As the siege settled into its rhythm, life inside Constantinople changed quietly but completely. Each morning began with the sound of bells and prayer, followed by the steady routines of survival. Soldiers took their positions along the walls, watching the Ottoman camp spread across the fields beyond. Civilians moved through the city with caution, carrying water, repairing homes, and gathering supplies. There was fear, but there was also familiarity. The city had been besieged before, and many believed it could endure again. The Theodosian walls dominated the landscape. They were vast, layered, and thick, stretching for miles across the landward side of the city. For centuries, they had been the reason Constantinople survived. Towers rose at intervals, allowing defenders to watch every movement outside. Deep ditches lay before the walls, adding another obstacle to any attacker. But now, the walls faced something new. Each day, the Ottoman cannons fired their massive stone projectiles. The ground shook with every impact. Dust filled the air. Stones cracked and shifted under repeated strikes. These cannons were slow and difficult to manage, requiring hours to reload. But their psychological effect was powerful. They announced, again and again, that the age of invincible walls was ending. At night, the defenders worked relentlessly. Under the cover of darkness, they repaired breaches, reinforced weak points, and cleared rubble. Wood, earth, and stone were packed tightly into damaged sections. Exhaustion became constant, but morale held. As long as the walls stood, hope remained. Inside the Ottoman camp, life followed a very different rhythm. Mehmed II maintained strict discipline among his forces. Soldiers prayed regularly, trained methodically, and followed clear chains of command. Supplies were organized, routes secured, and engineers worked continuously. The Ottoman army was not a chaotic horde. It was an organized machine designed to outlast resistance through persistence. Mehmed himself was deeply involved in the siege. He observed the walls, consulted his commanders, and adjusted tactics carefully. He understood that victory would not come quickly. The city needed to be worn down, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. As days turned into weeks, tension increased on both sides. Inside Constantinople, supplies grew thinner. Food was rationed carefully. Water sources were protected. Every injury mattered. Every loss felt heavier. Still, the defenders refused to surrender. Emperor Constantine XI moved among his people, offering encouragement and reinforcing the belief that the city could still be saved. Religious services became more frequent. Churches filled with worshippers seeking reassurance. Processions moved through the streets, carrying icons and relics believed to offer divine protection. Faith became both comfort and resistance. Outside the walls, Mehmed prepared a move that would change the siege entirely. The Golden Horn, a natural harbor on the city's northern side, had long been protected by a massive chain stretched across its entrance. This barrier prevented enemy ships from entering and attacking the city's sea walls. As long as the chain held, the defenders felt secure on that front. Mehmed chose not to attack the chain directly. Instead, he ordered his ships to be transported overland. Using logs, grease, and sheer manpower, Ottoman forces dragged vessels across hills and forests under the cover of night. It was an enormous logistical effort requiring coordination and silence. When the ships were launched into the Golden Horn behind the chain, the effect was immediate and devastating. The defenders awoke to find enemy ships where none should have been. This moment marked a turning point. Morale inside the city suffered deeply. The sense of isolation increased. The Ottomans now threatened the city from multiple directions, forcing defenders to stretch their already limited manpower even thinner. The siege intensified. Ottoman forces launched repeated attacks, testing different sections of the walls. Some assaults were repelled easily, others came dangerously close to success. Each attack drained energy, patience, and hope. Inside the city, exhaustion became visible. Soldiers slept where they stood. Civilians worked without rest. The sound of cannons became constant, blending into the background of daily life. Silence, once comforting, now felt heavy. Despite everything, the defenders held. Weeks passed. April turned into May. Mehmed understood that the siege could not last forever. He prepared for a final, decisive assault. Artillery fire increased. Troops were repositioned. Plans were refined carefully. The goal was not chaos, but precision. Inside Constantinople, the signs were unmistakable. The walls were weakened. Defenders were exhausted. Reinforcements had not arrived. Emperor Constantine XI gathered his commanders and spoke openly about the situation. There would be no surrender. The city would stand or fall together. On the night of May 28th, 1453, a final religious procession moved through Constantinople. Citizens, soldiers, and leaders gathered in Hagia Sophia, praying together beneath its vast dome. Differences that had divided the city in the past faded in the face of what lay ahead. Outside the walls, Ottoman forces prepared silently. The final assault was near. The final day began before sunrise. In the early hours of May 29th, 1453, the city of Constantinople lay in an uneasy stillness. Inside the walls, few people slept. Soldiers stood at their posts, gripping weapons worn smooth by weeks of use. Civilians gathered in small groups, whispering prayers or sitting quietly in their homes, listening for sounds from beyond the walls. Outside the city, the Ottoman camp was already awake. Mehmed II had planned the final assault carefully. He understood that victory would come not from a single rush, but from exhaustion, pressure, and timing. His forces were organized into waves, each with a specific purpose. The goal was to wear down the defenders until resistance finally broke. As dawn approached, Ottoman artillery intensified its fire. Cannons thundered against the weakened walls, sending fragments of stone into the air. Dust rose in thick clouds, settling over the city like a fog. The ground trembled beneath the repeated impacts. Defenders braced themselves, knowing that this bombardment was meant to soften the walls for what was coming next. When the first wave advanced, it was composed of irregular troops and auxiliaries. Their task was not necessarily to succeed, but to exhaust the defenders further. Fighting erupted along the walls. Arrows were fired, stones were thrown. Shouts echoed through the smoke and dust. The defenders repelled this initial assault, but at a cost. As the first wave fell back, Mehmed sent in more experienced troops. The pressure increased steadily. Each assault forced the defenders to expend more energy, more ammunition, and more hope. Repairs that had once been possible between attacks were now impossible. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI moved among his men. He wore no imperial regalia. He spoke not as a distant ruler, but as a fellow defender. Witnesses later recalled his calm determination and refusal to abandon his post. The fighting intensified as the elite Janissary units prepared to advance. These soldiers were highly trained, disciplined, and loyal to the Sultan. When they moved forward, they did so with purpose. The defenders, already exhausted, struggled to respond with the same strength they had shown earlier. At one of the most critical sections of the wall, Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander whose leadership had been essential, was seriously wounded. Accounts differ on the exact nature of the injury, but its effect was immediate. Giustiniani was carried away from the wall, and with him went a sense of stability. Confusion spread among the defenders. Some believed the walls were already lost. Others continued fighting, unaware of what was happening elsewhere. Coordination broke down. Orders were misunderstood. The pressure of weeks of siege collapsed into moments of chaos. In the midst of this confusion, Ottoman troops found an opening. Through a weakened section of the wall, attackers poured into the city. Resistance continued fiercely in some areas, but the balance had shifted. The defenders were no longer able to contain the breach. Emperor Constantine XI was last seen near the fighting, refusing to retreat. According to later accounts, he removed the symbols of his rank and fought alongside his soldiers. His death marked the end of the Byzantine imperial line, a dynasty that traced its roots back to ancient Rome. By mid-morning, organized resistance had ended. Constantinople had fallen. As Ottoman forces spread through the city, Mehmed II entered later that day. He rode through the gates, observing the city that had occupied his thoughts for so long. Despite the violence that accompanied the conquest, Mehmed moved quickly to establish order. He issued commands to stop uncontrolled destruction and declared Constantinople the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. His goal was not to erase the city, but to claim it One of Mehmed's first symbolic acts was to visit Hagia Sophia. For nearly 1,000 years, the great church had stood as the heart of Byzantine religious life. Its vast dome, towering columns, and shimmering mosaics had inspired awe in generations of worshippers. Mehmed ordered the building to be converted into a mosque, marking the transition of power and the beginning of a new chapter in the city's history. Yet Hagia Sophia was not destroyed. It was preserved, adapted, and incorporated into the new Ottoman capital. In the days that followed, Mehmed began the process of rebuilding Constantinople. He understood that a capital required people, trade, and stability. He encouraged Muslims, Christians, and Jews from across the empire to settle in the city. Artisans, merchants, scholars, and administrators were invited to help restore its vitality. Slowly, life returned. Markets reopened, homes were repaired, religious communities reorganized under new rules. Constantinople, now increasingly referred to as Istanbul, began its transformation into one of the most important cities of the early modern world. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves far beyond its walls. In Europe, the loss of the city was met with shock and mourning. It marked the final end of the Byzantine Empire, which had preserved ancient Roman law, literature, and tradition for centuries. Scholars fleeing the city carried manuscripts westward, contributing to the intellectual revival known as the Renaissance. Trade routes shifted as Ottoman control over eastern passages increased. European powers, seeking alternatives, began exploring new maritime routes. These efforts would eventually lead to the Age of Exploration, reshaping global history. For the Ottoman Empire, the conquest established legitimacy and confidence. Mehmed II would go on to rule as a powerful and ambitious emperor, expanding his territories and strengthening his state. Constantinople became the center of Ottoman administration, culture, and power. The city itself remained a place of layers. Roman foundations lay beneath Byzantine churches, which stood beside Ottoman mosques. Languages, religions, and traditions coexisted within its walls. The echoes of its past never fully disappeared. Today, the fall of Constantinople is remembered as more than a military event. It is remembered as a moment when one era gave way to another, when medieval structures of power dissolved and early modern systems emerged, when the idea of permanence was challenged by the reality of change. The city that once seemed eternal did not vanish, it transformed. History often moves this way, not always through sudden collapse, but through long preparation, quiet shifts, and decisive moments that bring centuries to a close. As the sun rose over Constantinople on that morning in 1453, few could have fully understood the scale of what had occurred. Yet the world had changed. Empires ended, new powers rose, and the course of history moved forward, shaped by the slow accumulation of time, ambition, and human effort. This is how Constantinople fell, and this is how a new world began. In the weeks that followed the fall of Constantinople, the city did not descend into endless chaos, as many had feared. Instead, a slower and more complex process began, one that would reshape the city without erasing its past. Mehmed II understood that conquest alone was not enough. A ruined city could not serve as the heart of an empire. What mattered now was stability, order, and continuity. Almost immediately, he began issuing instructions that focused not on destruction, but on restoration. Streets were cleared of debris. Guard posts were established to prevent disorder. Markets, though quiet at first, were allowed to reopen. Slowly, cautiously, people stepped back into public spaces, testing the new reality that had taken shape around them. For many of Constantinople's residents, daily life became an exercise in adjustment rather than resistance. The city they knew still stood. The streets followed the same paths. The walls remained. The churches, though changed in status, still existed. What had altered was authority, and with it, the rhythms of governance. Mehmed declared Constantinople the official capital of the Ottoman Empire, elevating it above all other cities in his realm. This decision alone ensured that the city would not be abandoned or diminished. Instead, it would be invested in, rebuilt, and repopulated. One of Mehmed's earliest priorities was population. Centuries of war, plague, and economic decline had left Constantinople underpopulated. To restore its vitality, Mehmed ordered families from across the empire to relocate to the city. Muslims, Christians, and Jews were all encouraged to settle there. Craftsmen, merchants, scholars, and administrators arrived in waves, bringing skills and traditions that would shape the city's future. This was not an act of erasure, but of layering. New neighborhoods formed beside old ones. Ottoman architectural styles began to appear alongside Byzantine structures. Languages mixed in markets and courtyards. The city became, once again, a place of intersection rather than isolation. Religious life adapted in complex ways. Hagia Sophia, now a mosque, became a symbol of the new order, but other churches were allowed to continue operating. Mehmed appointed a new Orthodox patriarch, granting the Christian community a degree of autonomy under Ottoman law. This system, later known as the Millet system, allowed religious communities to govern many of their own internal affairs. For many residents, this continuity softened the shock of change. Life resumed its routines, not because the past had been forgotten, but because the present demanded it. Children returned to streets and courtyards. Fishermen returned to the water. Merchants reopened shops that had been closed for weeks. At the same time, the city itself began to change in quieter ways. Ottoman administrators reorganized districts. New roads were planned. Public baths, schools, and charitable foundations were established. These institutions were not merely practical. They were statements of permanence. They signaled that Constantinople was no longer a contested prize, but a settled capital. Mehmed himself took a keen interest in the city's transformation. He walked its streets, studied its buildings, and commissioned projects that reflected both his ambition and his respect for history. He collected ancient texts, patronized scholars, and envisioned Constantinople as a center of learning as well as power. In this way, the city did not simply fall into a new era. It was guided into one. Yet beyond its walls, The consequences of 1453 continued to unfold. Across Europe, the loss of Constantinople lingered in the collective consciousness. It was spoken of in sermons, letters, and courtly discussions. For many, it represented the closing of a chapter that had begun with Rome itself. Merchants felt the change quickly. Trade routes through the eastern Mediterranean now passed firmly under Ottoman control. Taxes, regulations, and diplomacy reshaped commerce. Some adapted, others sought alternatives. These pressures would, over time, push European powers to look outward, toward the Atlantic, toward Africa, and eventually toward the Americas. In this indirect way, the fall of Constantinople helped set the stage for global exploration. Back in the city, however, life was not shaped by grand narratives, but by daily reality. People learned new laws. New officials learned old streets. Trust was rebuilt slowly, one transaction at a time. The memory of siege faded unevenly, sharper for some, softer for others. Constantinople had not ended. It had transitioned. As the years passed, Constantinople slowly grew into its new role, not as a fallen relic, but as a functioning capital once more. Under Ottoman rule, the city did not lose its importance. It gained a new kind of relevance. It became a center of administration, trade, scholarship, and diplomacy, linking worlds that had once stood apart. Mehmed II ruled with an awareness of history that shaped many of his decisions. He did not see himself merely as a conqueror, but as a successor to empire. In his own mind, he was not destroying Rome's legacy. He was inheriting it. He adopted titles that echoed imperial authority and governed from the same city that Roman and Byzantine emperors had once ruled. This sense of continuity mattered. The city's skyline changed gradually rather than suddenly. New mosques rose beside old churches. Markets expanded. Caravan routes were restored. The soundscape of the city evolved, but it did not fall silent. Bells, calls, voices, and footsteps continued to mark the passage of days. For ordinary people, history was not something abstract. It was experienced through stability or its absence. Under Ottoman administration, law became predictable. Taxes were organized. Security returned. These changes allowed families to plan, trade, and rebuild their lives. Memory, however, lingered. Those who had lived through the siege carried its weight quietly. Some remembered fear. Others remembered loss. Over time, these memories softened, becoming stories told rather than wounds reopened. New generations grew up knowing the city only as it was, not as it had been. Constantinople became Istanbul, not through erasure, but through accumulation. The city absorbed influences from across the empire. Scholars arrived from Persia. Artisans came from Anatolia and the Balkans. Jewish communities, expelled from Western Europe, found refuge within its walls. Each group added to the city's rhythm, texture, and identity. In this way, the city once again became what it had always been at its best, a meeting place. Beyond the city, the world continued to adjust to the shift that had occurred in 1453. European states re-evaluated alliances. Religious authorities debated meaning and consequence. Merchants adapted to new realities. Slowly, attention turned outward, toward new routes and possibilities. The fall of Constantinople was no longer just a recent event. It became a reference point, a dividing line between eras. Historians would later describe it as the end of the medieval world and the beginning of the early modern age. But for those who lived through it, the change was not sudden. It unfolded gradually, shaped by daily decisions rather than dramatic declarations. This is often how history truly moves. Not in sharp breaks, but in quiet transitions. Not through single moments, but through long periods of adjustment and acceptance. The walls that once defined Constantinople remained standing. The streets followed familiar paths. The sea continued to carry ships between continents. Time did not pause for grief or celebration. It continued forward. And in that forward movement, the city endured. Today, when we look back on the fall of Constantinople, it is tempting to see it only as an ending. But it was also a beginning. It marked the close of one chapter and the opening of another, written in a different language, under a different authority, but on the same ground. The city did not disappear. It changed. Empires rise and fall, but places remain. They absorb memory. They hold layers of meaning. Constantinople, Istanbul, stands as a reminder that history is not simply lost when power shifts. It is reshaped, reinterpreted, and carried forward by those who live within it. As night settles over the city once more, the lights along the water reflect softly on the Bosphorus. The walls stand quiet. The streets rest. Life continues, as it always has. And so, the story does not end with destruction, but with continuity. A city transformed, a world adjusted.